Thank you, Betsy. I'm delighted to see such interest in Cuba, as indicated by the size of this audience, and I hope I can live up to your expectations of trying to explain what is going on in Cuba and the changes underway there, but also the changes in U.S. policy toward Cuba that were announced on December 17th of this last year. What I want to explore is the link between these two changes, a link that is generally not well understood. I want to focus on the changes in Cuba first by looking at the relation between state and society. I want to begin with some general points about the state-society relation in a very different context, one more familiar to us, namely the United States. What is the role of government there? Well, looking first at the U.S. Constitution, we see that in the preamble, the Union of States was to ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, establish justice, and promote the general welfare. That's the language of the preamble. That is, a very positive and active role was envisioned for the government that was being established. The task before that founding generation was to build a nation, so obviously they needed an active government. That active role contrasts sharply with what we often hear today from political leaders. Under the prevailing neoliberal capitalist ideology that prevails in the U.S., it is the market, not government, that is supposed to steer society. That market is the sum of individual self-interested choices, as unguided and unrestrained as possible by government, no matter how democratic that government might be. The market is to be as free of government action as possible according to this laissez-faire ideology. Democracy is conceived as the freedom of autonomous, asocial individuals. Government should simply get out of the way. Get government off our backs, intoned Ronald Reagan. Well, this neoliberalism is a starkly undemocratic, even anti-democratic ideology. In democratic ideology, government is not the enemy, but rather the instrument of the popular will to do collectively what individuals cannot do so well for themselves. As I've put the point elsewhere, democracy is the possibility of collective decision-making for collective action for the common good. That is how justice is established and the general welfare promoted. Well, that is the vision that guided the social liberalism that was represented in the New Deal. When we speak of liberalism today, it's usually social liberalism that we have in mind. This social liberalism arose from the social movements of the 1930s in their demand for justice in the face of a capitalism in crisis, the Great Depression of the 1930s. The market had been shown not to be self-regulating and was not able to promote the general welfare. Instead, it produced great inequalities of wealth and power, as might have been expected by reflecting on the popular board game Monopoly. However, the New Deal did not come to abolish that cruel game of capitalism, but to save it from itself. Social liberalism undertook to regulate capitalist markets and protect the unfortunate from its negative effects. In so doing, it accepted the reality of a class-divided society and function to maintain it while tempering it with a measure of justice in response to popular demands so as to be able to ensure domestic tranquility. And so, social liberal capitalism became the dominant public ideology until its exhaustion in the 1970s and replacement by neoliberal capitalism. To understand the relationship between the state and society, we have to look at class power. Capitalism is a class-divided society. It is divided between those who own the means of production and those who do not, and thus have to work for the former. There are other classes as well, to be sure, but capitalists and workers make up the two major classes. Capitalists are in an economically dominant position, although that power can be curtailed by government when the popular classes are sufficiently active politically, as was the case in the 1930s. Social liberalism was possible because the class power of capitalists was weakened by the Great Depression, and the working class was politically active and organized. Nevertheless, social liberalism retained a capitalist system because of the still considerable class power of capitalists. It thus preserved an economic system in which capitalists retained the economically dominant position, and with that class power were able to eventually rise again and weaken the fetters they experienced from the regulatory state. Any regulatory regime is unstable in capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism is the default position of capitalism in the absence of the power of the working class. Well, with that as background, let me turn our attention to Cuba. With Cuba, we find a very different state-society configuration. After the Cuban revolutionaries came to power, January 1, 1959, the function of the state that they constructed was not to maintain the social order, but to transform it. They had overthrown a capitalist state and undertook to construct a socialist alternative to the existing dependent capitalism. Socialism is a directed transition from capitalism toward communism, where communism is understood as a classless society without exploitation that is democratically directed by the associated producers. That's what communism was understood as being by Karl Marx and by other 19th century advocates. The difference between socialism and communism was encapsulated in two concise formulas of the post-capitalist relation between individuals and society, by Marx in his critique of the Gotha program. In the lower stage of communism, which has come to be called socialism, each member of society is expected to give according to his ability, work according to his ability, and receives back from society according to the work that he does. Basically, it's a meritocratic system. But that's a transition that leads eventually toward communism, where each is expected to contribute according to ability, but receives back from society according to need, not according to work. It's recognized that different people have different abilities and different people have different needs. And so the communist society is one in which society provides for the needs of its members regardless of their ability to work and produce on a comparable scale. Although Marx did not summarize the relation between individuals and societies in capitalism in such a neat, concise formula, it might be stated as, from each according to his poverty, to each according to his wealth. That is, it is those who are impoverished in the sense that they do not own their means of production, the means to work, who then have to labor for those who have that wealth and thereby become wealthier. Capitalism is a system in which those who have exploit those who do not have. Well, fundamentally, the Cuban Revolution then undertook to overcome this class division of exploitation. As a first step, it simply expropriated the property of foreign capitalists and those Cuban capitalists who had left the country. But where do you go from there? How do you move society beyond capitalism, constructing socialism and building the way toward communism? Unfortunately, there are no blueprints for such a directed transition of society. It was necessary to invent the way. And this has been done by a lot of trial and error over the last half-century. Broadly, we can see three periods in the Cuban experiment to found society anew. The first period was that of the 1960s. It was a revolutionary romantic period. The euphoria of release from the US-dominated neo-colonial capitalism motivated great idealism among the popular classes and the leadership. This was the period where efforts were made to build socialism and communism in parallel with each other, not as successive historical stages, but to build both of them at the same time. Accordingly, many social benefits were made available for free or at a minimum cost, like education, health care, transportation, telephone service, utilities, etc. As much as possible was to be provided to the population based upon their need rather than ability to pay, to each according to need. Revolutionary consciousness was to be the motivator for work. Revolutionary consciousness where each would feel impelled to contribute according to his abilities. And it would be that, not material reward, that would be the motivator for work. Che Guevara modeled this new socialist man through his voluntary labor. However, by the 1970s, going to a second period, it was seen as necessary to institutionalize a new system. It was during this decade that Cuba adopted the state socialist model from the Soviet Union. Based on the state ownership of the productive resources of society, the state undertook to direct the economy in a rational, planned way in the name of the working people of Cuba as a whole. With lots of trial and error along the way, this state socialism has prevailed up to the present. And indeed, state socialism after the Soviet model came to be the almost universally accepted notion of what socialism was. But now Cuba is undertaking to renovate its socialism, to renew it, to reform it. Various terms are used to characterize the process that is underway. As we will see, this involves moving away from that state socialist model and inventing a new one, more in tune with the original vision of socialists in the 19th century. As we look at the course of the Cuban experiment, I want to continue to focus on the role of the state and its relation to the economy. political democracy, consciousness, particularly revolutionary will, and the role of the popular classes. In the first stage of the 1960s, capitalist property was expropriated. Not personal property, just capitalist property that was used in production. And then in 1968, the property of the petty bourgeoisie was expropriated, small businesses. The state thus became the owner of the means of production of the whole of society, in the name of society as a whole. The state undertook to manage the entire economy according then to a plan. There was no longer a market. In the 70s, what I've called state socialism was institutionalized with the adoption of the Soviet model then. Basic needs were guaranteed with the provision of free health care, education, and a very egalitarian income scale. The state took care of the people, and in return, they gave it their loyalty. By 1976, a democratic political system was also institutionalized. Since little seems to be known about this in the US, let me describe the political system briefly. Poder popular, or people's power, as it is called, is a highly participatory and representative electoral system. Delegates are elected in their neighborhoods in nonpartisan elections based on their demonstrated civic activities. Their campaign consists of each candidate posting their picture and resume around the neighborhood. That's it. That's the whole of the campaign. Cuba has really taken money out of its politics. The cost of photocopying a resume is the only expense. Typically, voter turnout is in the 90+% range. To be elected, the U.S. is lucky to get much over 50%. To be elected, a candidate needs a majority of the votes cast. And if there are 3 or more candidates and no one gets a majority, they have a runoff. The delegates elected then form the municipal assembly. There's a similar process at the provincial level. And the national legislative body, or the National Assembly, is also selected by direct election and is made up both of national figures as well as local delegates. In fact, 50% of the members of the National Assembly have to have first been elected at the local level. As a result, the National Assembly is a broad cross-section of the Cuban population as a whole. Since this is a parliamentary system, the National Assembly then elects a government called the Council of State, and it then elects its officials, including the president. And it's important to understand that there are no adversarial political parties. There's only one political party, the Communist Party of Cuba, but it's not an electoral party. It does not run candidates. Candidates run on their own individual merits. In addition to being participatory, this system seeks to build consensus. When there are sharp divisions on an issue, there are consultas, consultations, held in every workplace, neighborhood, and school to get the opinion of the popular classes. It can take months, even years, to build consensus. One such popular consultation was held in the late 1980s. This came out of a growing concern that the Soviet model was growing too bureaucratic. So there was a several-year-long consulta called Rectification of Erroneous Tendencies and Errors. There had been low productivity due to a lack of worker incentives. The overly centralized hierarchical system was criticized. There were lots of participation, people said, yes, but little opportunity for initiative. A kind of passivity had spread among the population, the twin of the growing bureaucratization of the state. A Cuban friend of mine told me that although in socialism the state was supposed to gradually wither away, in fact, it was civil society that was withering away. The state-centric model of socialism was not leading toward communism. Well, so this process of popular participation in criticism pointed toward the need to make some fundamental changes in the system. Unfortunately, this move toward reform was interrupted by the economic crisis of the 1990s, after Cuba lost its advantageous trading relations with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The current reform efforts now can be seen as a continuation of that reform process begun but then interrupted nearly 30 years ago. So let me turn then to the renovation of socialism that is underway. Looking first of all at how the plan was developed. The popular consultas for a reform program began on July 26, 2007, when Raúl Castro asked the people to discuss the future of Cuba's socio-economic development. More than 1.3 million proposals were put forward in the subsequent debates. 2 years later, in further popular consultation, nearly 2.3 million proposals were added for action, supportive comments, suggestions, and criticisms. Proposals for reform were consolidated into a draft document called Economic and Social Policy Guidelines for the Party and the Revolution, or Lineamientos. That consisted of 291 points, filling 32 pages, and was released in November of 2010 for further public discussion. The draft guidelines were analyzed in 163,000 meetings in work centers, schools, and neighborhood meetings. In all, there were almost 9 million participants in these discussions, of a population of 11.5 million. Finally, after nearly 4 years of discussions with the people, in April of 2011, these guidelines were adopted as policy for the reform of the Cuban economy. After all of that, who can say that Cuba is not democratic? Can you imagine anything like that happening in our countries? So, what is this reform program? What is being changed? I want to focus on what I think are the most fundamental changes. Changes that portend a new model of socialism. While not abandoning a central role for the state, basically the reforms involve moving away from the state socialist model toward one with a far more active civil society. The opening section of the guidelines on the economic management model brings into focus the changed relation between the state and society that is envisioned. Quote, "The management model recognizes and promotes, as well as the socialist state enterprise, which is the principal form of the national economy, but also the legally sanctioned modalities of foreign investment, mixed enterprises, international contractual arrangements, and the like, cooperatives, peasant farmers, leasers of state-owned farmland, leasers of state-owned premises, self-employed workers, and other forms, all of which together must contribute to boosting efficiency." Close quote. Cuba is looking toward a far more mixed economy. 84% of the Cuban workforce had worked for the state. This led to overstaffing and low worker motivation. The Cuban state has been the employer of last resort. You might almost say the employer of first resort. At least 1 million state workers are redundant, and the state can no longer afford that. So large numbers are being laid off and are shifting into non-state sectors of the economy. This growing sector encompasses the self-employed, or cuentapropistas as they're called, self-employed, and cooperatives. The small private businesses that had been expropriated back in 1968, an act that is now seen as having been a mistake, they're now being recreated in order to absorb the redundant state workers. There is a recognition that there is a place for a petty bourgeoisie in socialism. The state does not need to, nor is it able to do everything. Many economic activities can be left to individual entrepreneurs, so long as they are regulated and taxed so that the petty bourgeoisie does not become a big bourgeoisie. As the guidelines state, quote, "In the forms of non-state management, the concentration of property ownership by juridical or natural persons shall not be permitted." They don't want a wealthy 1% emerging. Private businesses are now allowed to employ wage labor. Curiously, these wage laborers are also called self-employed. Previously, employment in such businesses was limited to family members, but now all the authorized areas for self-employment can employ others outside of the family as wage laborers. There is a requirement that employers pay Social Security taxes for their employees as well as for themselves to compensate the state for the social benefits that it provides. Now, I've asked several people, what was the rationale for wage labor in a socialist society? How can they justify this private exploitation of labor? It's forbidden in the Constitution, and is it even necessary? If a business needs more labor power than is available in the family, why not organize it as a cooperative? That way all can benefit from their collective labor and participate in collective decision-making. Well, the answer I got was a blunt, there is no rationale for wage labor in socialism. The most that was said for this reform was the suggestion that it is necessary as a short-term measure to quickly absorb surplus workers. It is recognized that the formation of co-ops is a better solution in the long term, and that is what is now coming into play. While Cuba has had cooperatives since the early years of the revolution, they were limited to agriculture. However, in December of 2012, the National Assembly passed an urban co-op law that establishes the legal basis for new urban cooperatives, non-agricultural co-ops. Here are some of the main provisions of that law. And they're going to revisit it and develop an improved co-op law next year in 2016 based on their initial experience. But to start with, these are the provisions for co-ops now. A co-op must have at least 3 members, but may have as many as 60 or more. 1 vote per member. As self-governing enterprises, co-ops are to set up their own internal democratic decision-making structures. Co-ops are independent of the state. They're supposed to respond to the market. This is to overcome the limits that hampered some agricultural co-ops in the past. Co-ops can do business with state and private enterprises. They will set their own prices in most cases. Some co-ops will be conversions of state enterprises. For example, a lot of the state restaurants now are being reorganized as cooperatives run by the former state employees. They can have 10-year renewable lease for use of the premises, paying no rent in the first year if improvements are made. Other co-ops are startup co-ops. There will be second-degree co-ops, which are associations of other co-ops. Capitalization for co-ops, and this is an important factor, will come from bank loans, a new finance ministry fund for co-ops, and can come from member contributions. Member contributions are treated as loans, though, not equity, and do not give additional votes. Loans are to be repaid from future profits. Co-ops are to pay taxes on profits and Social Security for their members. But the tax rate for co-ops is lower than the tax rate for private businesses. Distribution of profits is to be decided by the members after setting aside a reserve fund. And co-ops may hire wage labor on a temporary basis, only up to 90 days. After 3 months, a temporary worker must be offered membership or let go. And total temporary worker time cannot exceed 10% of the total work days for the year. This gives co-ops flexibility to hire extra workers seasonally or in response to increased market demands, but it prevents significant collective exploitation of wage labor. Well, as of last summer, 498 of these new urban co-ops had been authorized. There are additional co-ops that are functioning but not yet recognized as legal entities. This is a big step forward for Cuba. Cooperative members have an incentive to make the business a success. The co-op is on its own to either prosper or go under. Each member's income and security depend on the collective. And each has the same voting right in the General Assembly where co-op policy is made. Co-ops combine material and moral incentives, linking individual interest with a collective interest. Each member prospers only if all prosper. In a study of 29 new cooperatives, Camila Pinheiro-Hanecker, a Cuban researcher, found that incomes have increased an average of 3-fold and as much as 7-fold in some cases. The renovation of socialism, now underway in Cuba, is an effort to reinvigorate civil society, opening up spaces for initiative outside of the state. In the next few years, the non-state sector of the economy, consisting of cooperatives and private businesses, is projected to provide 35% of employment. And along with foreign and joint enterprises, 45% of the gross domestic product. Addressing the problem of the lack of worker incentives under state socialism, these reforms are unleashing new productive energies that will lift the economy. But beyond that, they stand to replace the passive participation of state socialism with the protagonistic participation better suited to a democratic socialism. And this implies a new relation between state and civil society. One of the new cooperatives I visited last June, and if you come with me this June, you'll visit this one and others as well. I visited a small bar and restaurant in a poor section of central Havana. It's a former state enterprise. The Okinawa Bar Cooperative has 5 members. It had been a cooperative for only 8 months, and the president told me that being able to make their own decisions is one of the greatest benefits they find. He was elected by his fellow workers. Interestingly, the former state manager, who is also a member, was not elected to lead the new cooperative. The motivation engendered by this empowerment was dramatically demonstrated by a self-organized construction cooperative we met at the Institute of Philosophy. They were repairing the Institute building that had been badly damaged 2 years ago when the ceiling of the main first floor room collapsed, rendering most of the building unusable. A state construction company had made little progress on the repairs for the previous 2 years. But now the Institute has been able to engage this newly formed construction cooperative, and in a short time they've made major progress. Our group was scheduled to have a meeting at the Institute on a Monday morning, and between the previous Thursday and that morning, the ceiling had been rewired and plastered. And by the following week, the Institute staff was moving back into their offices on the second floor. The 20 co-op members are motivated by the fact that for the first time they control their work. They make the decisions. This is a powerful demonstration of the strength of cooperatives. Well, what we are seeing here then, with the promotion of new cooperatives in Cuba, is the constituted power of the state nurturing the constituent power in civil society. Cooperatives are a socialist form of property under democratic management. As such, cooperatives have the virtue of nurturing socialist values, responsibility, democratic decision-making, cooperation, and social solidarity. They are what I like to call little schools of socialism. They embed socialism into the daily life of working people, engendering a socialist civil society. In this respect, they contrast with the new petty bourgeois small and medium-sized private businesses, now also being opened by the self-employed. A petty bourgeoisie is seen as compatible with socialism, as I said earlier. Compatible as long as it's regulated and taxed so that it doesn't become a big bourgeoisie. Great inequalities of income and accumulation of wealth are to be avoided. But it is clear that a petty bourgeoisie is not socialist. It does not nurture a socialist consciousness, but the narrow mentality of the petty shopkeeper. It does not nurture socialist social relations, but individualism. A petty bourgeoisie may be compatible with socialism when kept within limits, but it is not socialist. Cooperatives, however, are socialist. They represent associated producers coming together on a small scale to govern their work life in a democratic way. It is this relation that the socialist transition needs to point toward. With the current opening to cooperatives, Cuba's state socialism is finding a new road forward. Socialism cannot be built top-down by state power alone. It has to be rooted in the base of society among ordinary people. Its values, its practices, and its social relations have to be built into daily life where people live and work. This is the virtue of cooperatives. Cooperatives can thus help make socialism irreversible. As Gramsci pointed out, the state penetrates down into civil society. Foucault, another philosopher, takes this a step further with his notion of governmentality. This refers to those systems of control that extend even into the subjectivity of the human, into the self. This is what makes a social system self-governing and self-replicating. Cooperatives educate their members to the values and practices of a participatory socialism. This is more than an invigoration of civil society. It is also construction of a socialist governmentality in Foucault's deeper sense. It is a re-socialization of workers away from their passivity under a paternalistic state socialism to protagonistic participants able to found society anew. Some Marxists see cooperatives as a step back from what they consider a more advanced state socialism, perhaps even a step toward capitalism. But my view is that it is a step forward toward a society ruled by the associated producers. If a social order is to be sustainable over the long run, it needs to be rooted in the character of its people, their values, their sensibilities, their taken for granted understandings, their very subjectivity needs to be consonant with its institutions. The socialist transition is a process that needs a people with a socialist character if it is to continue. The social relations of production help build such a character among the people. That is why it is of the utmost importance that cooperatives be widely promoted. The benefits of cooperatives need to be publicized, and training in cooperative practices needs to be available. There needs to be a network of promotores who go out into the society, like the literacy workers in the early 1960s, and teach the co-op way. The Cuban Institute of Philosophy is doing just that in Central Havana. And our Center for Global Justice, which has been offering cooperative workshops for several years now here in Mexico, is collaborating with the Institute in that effort. To state the current juncture in Cuba's efforts to construct socialism in bold terms, there is a race for the soul of Cuba, a race between the cooperative movement and the expanding private businesses. Which will make up the larger part of that 1/3 of non-state employment that is projected? Will it be socialist enterprises or proto-capitalist ones? The government is favoring the development of cooperatives. But now, there is a new player in this contest, the Obama administration. That's right. Obama's relaxation of relations with Cuba presents a new challenge for the revolution. While the belated decision to recognize that Cuba has its own government it took over a half century for the U.S. to recognize that point, while that is to be commended, there is another little noted aspect to the new U.S. policy toward Cuba. This lies in numerous measures to assist in the development of a nascent capitalist class from that private business sector. A careful reading of the new U.S. regulations reveals a concerted effort to direct resources to entrepreneurs within Cuba by means of remittances, material aid, training, and even trade. For example, the level of remittances allowed is now being increased so as to provide increased funding for private businesses. The December 17th White House press release states, quote, "Remittance levels will be raised from $500 to $2,000 per quarter for general donative remittances to Cuban nationals, except to certain officials of the government or the Communist Party," close quote. Similarly, the Commerce Department announced last month that exports of equipment and supplies to Cuba is allowed, as well as imports from Cuba, as long as the Cuban entity is independent of the government. So the U.S. is recognizing the Cuban government, but still treating it as a pariah. The U.S. seeks to expand, quote, opportunities for self-employment and private property ownership, strengthening independent civil society. The White House explicitly states, our efforts aim at promoting the independence of the Cuban people so they do not need to rely on the Cuban state, close quote. Well, in extending diplomatic relations to Cuba, the U.S. finally acknowledges that Cuba has a government. It's accepting the reality that destabilizing a close neighbor is not in the interest of the U.S. And that the policy to spread hunger and desperation within the country that would lead to the overthrow of the government has failed. It was obvious to everybody else decades ago. So, you know, the Obama administration has accepted that this hard line has not worked. Regime change in Cuba would not produce a stable society. You know, witness the regime change efforts in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, etc. Well, that strategy is what has failed. But alongside it for some years, there's been an increasing resort to what I euphemistically called democracy promotion programs. These involve support to opposition groups to strengthen civil society, as if there were no socialist civil society in Cuba. The civil society the U.S. supports is those small groups who are against the government. This approach has also been unsuccessful. Nevertheless, Obama announced its continuation. Upgrading the U.S. interest section in Havana to embassy status will not end its support of dissidents, nor will the CIA agents operating there under diplomatic cover be going home. The so-called democracy promotion programs will continue. Obama still thinks the U.S. has the right to shape the future of its neighbor. But what is new in Obama's approach is an emphasis on economic rather than political subversion. What is new in Obama's policy is a turn away from regime change to systemic change, changing the economic system. Recognizing the Cuban government does not mean accepting its socialist economic system. Now, many observers expect to see a flood of U.S. businesses into Cuba, but they forget that the embargo is still in place. Yeah. Obama has relaxed aspects of it, but ending it would require congressional action, not a likely prospect in the near future. In any case, Cuba has been very open to foreign investment for 20 years. Cuba recently enacted a new law on foreign investment designed to make it more attractive to investors from abroad. U.S. corporations are eager to get a piece of the action that the embargo has long denied them. But when they are able finally to get in, Cuba will no doubt apply the same kind of limits as they do on other foreign investment. That means it will be in partnership with the Cuban state and for a specific number of years. Cuba is not about to give up its sovereignty to transnational corporations. But what is more likely to transform Cuban society is that increased flow of money to individual private entrepreneurs in hopes of building the germ of a new capitalist class. This method takes advantage of Cuba's opening to a non-state sector of its economy that includes private businesses along with cooperatives and the foreign investment. Obama's aim is to help private businesses occupy as much of the non-state economic space as possible. The danger that presents to socialism lies in the fact that if they were to become a sizable part of the economy, the state, committed to the growth of the economy, would find it increasingly necessary to favor its interests. The basis of class power is not just direct control of the state, but a class's weight in the economy. That is why it is vital for the continued construction of socialism in Cuba that cooperatives come to occupy as much of the non-state sector as possible. Progressives need to think seriously about how we can support the growth of cooperatives, genuine democratic worker-run cooperatives. Cuba is now open to that, and Obama has cleared the way for us to accept this unique opportunity. Just as funds and materials can be sent to individuals as long as they are independent of the government, so too can they be sent to cooperatives, since they're also independent of government. And we can trade with Cuban co-ops as well, providing a wider market for their products. Obama's strategy is to change Cuba, not through regime change, but by promoting capitalism within the country through support of a petty bourgeoisie. After all, that has always been the fundamental objective of U.S. policy, to bring Cuba back into the capitalist orbit. We have a unique situation in Cuba today. A socialist state is actively promoting cooperatives, thereby devolving economic power to people at the grassroots level. There is a rejuvenation of civil society underway, a socialist civil society. Solidarity calls on us to help it move forward along this road to a socialism for the 21st century. Thank you.
Bill Fold is lost. Okay, I'm told that there is a lost Bill Fold, belongs to Peter Hefty Salmon from Minnesota. There is a lost Bill Fold that has been found, belongs to Peter Hefty Salmon from Minnesota. Is he here? Okay, see this guy to claim your Okay, now we'll open the floor to questions and comments. And please speak loud because you don't have a microphone. But I'll repeat your questions if necessary. In the back.
There are cooperatives in the United States currently operating, and there have been failed cooperatives in other countries. So I wish you could contrast why the Cuban cooperatives will be different from the ones in the United States or not fail as others have as well.
Well, the big difference is that in Cuba, cooperatives are operating in a socialist context with a state that supports them. In the United States, cooperatives operate in a capitalist context, in a capitalist market, usually with very little in the way of state support.
But there is a bank for cooperatives in the United States funded by the federal government.
Yeah, there is some support, but nothing on the scale of what is developing in Cuba. Nothing on the scale that would be needed to create what Cuba is headed toward, I believe, namely the first country in the world with cooperatives making up a major portion of its economy. And once you get a critical mass, they become mutually reinforcing and supportive, and thus all much stronger than individual co-ops could be in a different context.
What decisions those neighborhood committee make?
Which what?
What decisions those neighborhood people elected make? What kind of decisions do they make?
Okay, the delegates elected at the local level.
What was the question?
The question was, what kind of decisions do they make? Basically, they operate as ombudsmen for their neighborhood. They have the responsibility to carry the grievances and the problems from their neighborhood to whatever agencies or organizations are involved, and to try to make them more responsive to the population. The delegates have to periodically meet with their constituents to report back on what they've done and to receive criticism if they haven't done a good job, and they can be removed they serve for a 3-year term of office. Follow up on that?
Is there a mayor and councilman and things like that?
No, the legislative body is at the national level. The laws are made at the national level. We're talking about a small nation, 11.5 million people. So that's somewhat different.
Yeah, I'd like to
I
congratulate
was
you
going
on
to,
your
I was going to,
presentation.
I was going to recognize a woman, so
Oh, sorry.
alternate some.
I just returned from Cuba, just for a week, but we talked to a lot of Cubans when we were there. And what's your opinion on the, I see it as a problem of the professional class? All the doctors, nurses, physiotherapists, et cetera, who are being underpaid. I mean, we met so many of them working at the hotels, et cetera. How is that going to be resolved?
Okay.
in your opinion?
The question from a woman who's just returned from Cuba concerns professionals and the very low level of pay that they receive. Cuba has a two-currency system. There is the Cuban peso, and then there is what is called the convertible Cuban peso, which is worth a lot more. You can buy more with it. Professionals, doctors and professors and the like, are paid in Cuban pesos. And as a result have very low incomes. Cuba is moving toward a unifying of the monetary system so as to overcome this. But the situation that exists as a result of it is that you have bellhops working in a hotel receiving tips from foreign tourists in the convertible peso, earning many, many times the amount that a Cuban doctor or a professor or other professional could earn. Cubans have a great sense of humor, kind of gallows humor. One of the jokes, my favorite jokes that you hear in Cuba is about a Cuban named Carlos who comes into a bar and buys drinks for everybody and pays for it with convertible pesos. And someone asked him, well, where do you get all of those? And he said, oh, I'm the chief bellhop at the Havana Libre Hotel. Another round of drinks for everybody. And this goes on for quite a while until he gets pretty well soused. Someone then takes him home and knocks on the door. His wife comes to the door and she says, oh no, Carlos, you've been drinking again. And the fellow who befriended him said, oh yes, he got all of these convertible pesos as a bellhop. And his wife said, no, he's not a bellhop. He got those from his relatives in Miami. He's a mere neurosurgeon. Okay. Yes, we'll come to you now.
I want to congratulate you on your presentation. It was great. However, all of this started in 1959. Why did it get started? It got started because the U.S., the mafia, were just raping, literally, the Cubans. I have met Mr. McCarty and his Art Deco building behind the plaza in downtown Havana. My first trip to Cuba was 1970 when the Russians were established. Veradero had one little hotel called the Kawama, and then they had the International Hotel for the Russians. Right now, the cause of all of this mess originally was U.S. Why invite them back?
Well, they're not inviting them back.
Well,
I mean, they're trying to, what Cuba does is not based on what the U.S. wants.
I hope not.
It's based upon their own needs and their own values, their own agenda. They're trying to renovate their socialism to make it a more effective system. One of the slogans you see on billboards is, more revolution, better socialism. That's what they're aiming toward. They're not inviting the U.S. back. The U.S. would love to come back with guns blazing, no, not with guns blazing, but yeah, in full force, sending in McDonald's and the rest. But that ain't gonna happen. Cuba prizes the sovereignty that it has won by, 60 years of struggle. Actually, a struggle for sovereignty goes back to the mid-19th century. It's been a long course, and they're not going to surrender it. So they'll be very careful about how they allow U.S. Participation. And I'm sure that they will develop measures to counteract the effect of Obama's strategy of trying to promote these small private businesses. I mean, there are measures that the government can take, limit their size, limit the number of wage workers they can employ. If they become too profitable, have a graduated tax. There are things like that that can be done, and I'm sure will be. Back there.
I'd like to go back to the two-tier money system. When I was there a few years ago, I could see this as a tourist. You can see it, it's very obvious. And it's anything but communistic, right? I mean, it's not equal. There's nothing equal about it. And I could see it as a problem. I mean, and I don't see how that, if tourism is a very big part of the Cuban economy at the moment, how do you marry that with a cooperative system developing? I can't see the two systems uniting or being copacetic.
Well, the first step that they're taking in unifying the two currencies is to require that all business do their accounting in a single currency, in the convertible peso. That's just a small step. How they're going to manage the merging, is beyond me. It's a really big challenge. But that doesn't affect the cooperatives per se. I mean, for example, one of the cooperatives that is quite visible on the streets of Havana now is a bus system. You see these medium-sized yellow buses down the street with Cooperativa, in big letters on the side. These are cooperative buses. The drivers form the cooperative. The buses themselves are leased from the government because individuals don't have the money to buy buses, but they lease it from the government and run it as their own business, running on routes that are part of the municipal transportation system's plan, and it costs a little more, but they're air-conditioned buses, very comfortable, and they're and you pay in convertible pesos for the fare, and that's something that can easily continue to operate the same way once they have a single currency. Another hand here.
Why did the double currency system come into being in the first place? What was the purpose of it?
Oh, okay. That came about in the 90s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost 80% of its trade. The economy went into deep depression. And as a result, there were a lot of people, Cubans, hitting up tourists on the street, to buy dollars. Because they could, and they'd offer quite favorable exchange rates. But that just sort of opened the way to a lot of corruption and stuff. And so they decided what we need to do is to not allow dollars to circulate. People can have dollars, it's legal, but you can't spend dollars in Cuba. You have to convert them to these convertible Cuban pesos, and that's what you can then spend. So that was one way they were able to get control over that. The Cuban peso had gone to an exchange ratio of something like 120 to $1 US. And by establishing this dual currency system, they've been able to bring that down to about 24 pesos per dollar. And they were also able to do something else. They were able to capture the dollars in circulation so they could be used to bring in imports, medicines, food, and other things of that sort. Okay, here, let's give everybody a chance to raise questions.
Short
Yes.
question, to what extent, if at all, is there a free press?
Louder, please.
To what extent, if at all, is there a free press in Cuba, and is it a value within that society?
Okay. The Cuban media is basically state-controlled, or newspapers published by state-sponsored institutions. And there's been a lot of criticism of that. And the foremost critic these days is Raul Castro himself. He recognizes that the reforms require a more open flow of information and opinions. So, for example, the official Communist Party newspaper, Granma, which is the #1 paper in the country, now every Friday has a letters to the editor section. Little things like that are being done to try to, and Raul and other officials are encouraging journalists to be more independent-minded, to do investigative journalism. Don't just reproduce, government press releases like so many journalists in the U.S. do, but do some investigative work. But old habits die hard, and so it'll take a while for that to open up as much as is desired. There were some other hands who haven't been.
I have a comment. We've been to Cuba twice, 3 years ago for 7 weeks, and this January for 5 weeks, staying in Casa Particulares, which is the Cuban B&B, and they're run as part of probably the private enterprise, and maybe some of them are co-ops. But I'm talking to some of the owners who are really very connected with all the other particulares in the country. They tell me that, we were asking, how come the country is opening up? And they told me that, well, Fidel was an idealist, Raul is a pragmatist. And we kind of wonder now, they're both getting very old, what's going to happen when Raul goes?
Mm-hmm. Well, that contrast between Fidel and Raul is one that is often claimed, and there's some truth to it. But we shouldn't infer from that Fidel does not approve of the reforms that are underway. In fact, he gave a very important speech, I think it was in 2005, if I recall, or 2006, at the University of Havana in the Aula Magna, in which, a close quote, he said, "Among the many mistakes we have made, the most serious was in thinking that someone knew how to build socialism." And of course, the someone he's referring to is the Soviet Union. The mistake was in copying the Soviet model. So he recognized the need to find a different path forward. And that's the path that Raul has been blazing. And, Raul, since he became president, has been replacing a lot of the ministers and other officials and so on with people who are similarly pragmatically minded. And so, Raul said he's going to retire after his current term ends, but there's every likelihood that the reform process will continue even without him. Who else hasn't been recognized? Here and then you.
What is Cuba doing in the near term to deal with the shortages of everyday necessities?
Well, it's trying to trying to increase production, increase efficiency, by providing motivations for people to work better and harder. One of the more severe shortages is in food. Cuba imports a major part of its foodstuff. That is a major drain on the foreign exchange that the country has. And so one of the things that it instituted, beginning, I guess maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, was to take unused state land and turn it over to either individuals or to cooperatives who would farm it. Lease free, doesn't cost anything, free land, you don't own it, but you have the benefits from cultivating it. And the hope was that that would increase food production. It hasn't done as much as had been hoped for. For one thing, Cuba is a very highly urbanized population. And it's not easy to get people who've enjoyed the comforts of living in a city to go out into the countryside and work under the hot sun, usually with little in the way of tools, and to break up the land, because it had been unused for some years and was overtaken with brush that was very hard to remove. So there are all kinds of problems like that that have made that effort to increase food production less successful so far than had been hoped for. But that's one of the things they're doing. And you were next.
Given what the United States has demanded of Nicaragua, do you think that possibly the U.S. will be demanding in the future compensations or expropriations of the Miami mobsters?
Yeah, well, certainly Bacardi is demanding compensation. Many of the other foreign companies, Exxon, etc., that were expropriated, would like to have the value of their property returned to them, if not the property itself. Interestingly, at the time that expropriation took place of both U.S. and other foreign property, Cuba paid in long-term bonds all of those claims except the ones from the U.S. The U.S. refused to even discuss any settlement. All right? And so, now you've got 50-some years of interest accruing, but Cuba has been keeping accounts also. They've been keeping accounts of the cost of the embargo on their economy. And it's in the order of $1 trillion now. And so they have that counterclaim to offer. Yes?
Do you think any of this will affect what's going on in Guantanamo? Will that ever be? I remember hearing once that the U.S. paid rent to Cuba and Fidel was keeping the checks in his desk drawer and never cashing them. But do you think any of this that's happening now will change? Think they'll ever leave? Or?
Yeah, Guantanamo is Cuban territory, historically always has been. Came under U.S. control after the U.S. intervened in its war for independence from Spain back in 1898, and part of the U.S. willingness to let Cuba have a government involved a treaty that gave it the rights for the use of Guantanamo as a naval fueling station. That's the only use that was allowed, and not as a prison or anything like that. Cuba definitely wants it back, but obviously is not making a major issue of it. And the U.S., unfortunately, continuing to pursue this war on terror, finds it convenient to have a territory where they can imprison people that is under no one's jurisdiction, under no legal jurisdiction. So when the U.S. will give it up, I don't know. Maybe when the war on terror ends, but we're told that's an endless war. So, yes.
What do you think will happen when the masses get numbered out?
When what?
They already have it.
recently I was trying to get on the internet and never could. And what do you think when the masses get hold of the internet? How
Well,
much-
Cuba has internet, but very limited internet. That's because the fiber optic cable owned by AT&T that runs right by the island could not be used by Cuba under the embargo. US government wouldn't let them use it. And so Cuba's internet access was by satellite, which is slow and expensive. And so there's been very limited internet access in Cuba for some time. And its access has been prioritized, to institutions that need it, and to tourists staying in hotels and the like. A couple of years ago, Cuba did lay, with help from China, a fiber optic cable to Venezuela. That's been rather, that's completed, but it's been rather slow in changing actual access because the infrastructure within Cuba is not really able to handle that much in the way of internet service. One of the provisions in Obama's relaxation now is to allow US telecommunications companies to operate in Cuba. And so that is likely to change, in the near future. Also, it's possible to use US credit cards in Cuba now. Any credit card on a US bank you couldn't use. But now the banks are beginning, and it'll take a while for this to be fully in place, beginning to announce that they have ATM access to your funds in the US bank when you're in Cuba.
What I was really after is, how do you think it will change the people?
Oh, how will it change the people? Well,
What people?
Because once everybody can see what the world's about.
yeah.
On a quick basis.
Well, certainly it will give people much more access to a lot more information. But people get a lot of information about what's going on in the world anyway. I've taken US students to Cuba who have met with their Cuban counterparts, and they come away amazed at how well informed the Cuban youth are. That's by various means. Thumb drives are passed around, so a lot of information is passed from person to person that way. But there's also TV. A major part of Cuban television programming is movies from the US. And some pretty bad ones too. You'd think they'd be more discerning, but yes.
Just a comment. There's a lot of questions that are coming out of here, being asked of you. How do you see the changes that are going to be going on in Cuba as we proceed in this negotiation? And also, the other aspect of what I want to mention is that you've given us an outline of what the Obama administration would like to, how they would like to see things change in Cuba. One of the things that I am wondering about is, I've been reading a book, although I haven't finished it, is called Back Channels to Cuba. You probably are aware of that, and as I go through it, I'm just really astonished at how, in the past, the alleged negotiations that went on at a certain level that we as a public were aware of were really had other possibilities and other forces that were in play as far as the U.S. government is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I'm thinking of is, right now, this is Obama's move. But there's a lot of opposition to Obama, period. And probably I would say that they'll stop at nothing to just knock over whatever you're doing.
Yeah, Obama has gone about as far as he can under existing legislation. Up until the Clinton administration, the embargo had been established by presidential executive order and could have been ended with a stroke of the pen. But in the 90s, Congress got into the act and passed Torricelli bill and the
Burton Helms?
yeah, yeah, right. Helms-Burton.
There you go.
Helms-Burton bill, which established in statutory law the embargo. Now to change it would require acts of Congress. There was discretion allowed to the administration, and Obama has taken advantage of that discretion now. But there's a limit as to how far he can go. And even though it is up to the president to decide whether to recognize the government of another country, there's a lot of obstacles that those in Congress who are opposed to his policy are able to erect. And it's right-wing Cuban Americans who are chair of both the Senate and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. The nomination of any ambassador has to be approved there. Yeah? And they're not going to approve any ambassador. So we may end up with an embassy in Havana, but no ambassador per se. So there are those kinds of things. One of the other changes that he has said he would make, and this has become a point of some contention, is Cuba has been listed on the state supporters of terrorism list of the State Department. Now, Cuba is not a state supporter of terrorism, never has been, but it was for political reasons that the right-wing Cuban Americans in Miami got Cuba put on that list because that strengthened the sanctions against them. Well, Cuba said he is now asking the Treasury Department, or excuse me, the State Department, to review that and see if Cuba can be removed from that. And Cuba sees that as a major priority that has to be done before they can really move ahead. For example, right now, in order to go to Cuba, you need a Cuban visa. You get a Cuban visa through the Cuban interest section in Washington, but you can't pay for it because no bank in the United States wants to deal with a country that is on that state sponsors of terrorism list. There are all kinds of reporting requirements and penalties that they become vulnerable to. And so Cuba said, how can we go forward until that issue is resolved? And hopefully it will soon. The clock is ticking. Next month is the Summit of the Americas, where Obama will meet with the heads of state of all of the other countries of Latin America. And the reason Cuba is included is because at the last summit, the countries of Latin America, in a unified voice, said, if Cuba is not allowed to come to the next one, we won't be here. Right? So that put a lot of pressure on Obama to recognize Cuba. And he needs to, to get this issue of the state terrorism supporter issue resolved so that he can go to that summit meeting with the expectation was that it would be with the acclaim of the countries of Latin America. However, something else has happened just last week. The Obama administration declared a state of national emergency because of the threat to national security and U.S. foreign policy presented by Venezuela. And the countries of Latin America are saying, what's going on here? Venezuela is not a threat to the security of the United States. Maybe a threat to U.S. foreign policy that wants to establish domination over the continent. But we don't want to be dominated by the Yankees either, so that's okay with us. So Obama is likely to get a somewhat cool reception at that summit. Yes.
We've been dealing with Naomi Klein's book on This Changes Everything, and I wonder to what extent the Cuban government, the state socialist government, is aware of the growing climate problem, and especially the fossil fuel energy. And are they doing anything? Do they know about it?
Yes. No, they're certainly aware of the problem. They have limited resources to develop alternatives. Sure, they've got lots of great sunlight, but they don't really have the technology, the photovoltaics and the like, to make full use of that. But they're certainly aware of the impact that climate change can have. Cuba has been, in the last decade, hit by a number of monster hurricanes, and they know that there are more in the future unless something can be done about climate change. And as an island in that hurricane-prone Caribbean area, they've got a, they're very vulnerable.
Can you speak of the fact that food to that country is very difficult to get because it's imported? With the weather changing, etc.
Yeah,
does that affect the fishing and everything else?
It affects agriculture, right? I mean, the storms have wiped out, major crop areas, and the superstorms they've had in recent years. So, it takes quite a toll. Yes.
But I just read recently that
Speak up, please.
Yeah, speak up.
it was UNESCO who designated Cuba as the most sustainable country in the world. Because they grew out of the 90s where they had nothing, I mean, no oil or anything, so they have progressed from that to, they have a quite a strong, I understand, urban agriculture.
Yeah, Cuba is one of the few countries that lives within its carbon footprint. And part of that is because of their conversion to organic agriculture in the 90s, during this special period. When they no longer had oil, pesticides, fertilizers, tractors, etc. They had to go organic in their agriculture, and so that lowered their carbon footprint and enabled them actually to rejuvenate the soil. Industrial agriculture depletes the soil. You can continue to have crops only by putting more and more fertilizer, more and more chemicals into it. But organic agriculture has rejuvenated the soil, enriched the soil, thereby increasing its capacity to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. So there are all kinds of benefits there that are part of this. The hand in the back has been straining.
I'll make it short.
Okay.
And the gentleman brought up the freedom of press, which I think is interesting. I'm not a lawyer from the United States, but that has nothing to do with it. But what is the status of the judiciary? And I don't expect in a socialist country that there would ever be a free and independent judiciary, but with this concept of being new and creative and carving out this blending that you are talking about with the co-ops, a lot of world countries or companies are not going to deal enthusiastically with a nation that does not have a judiciary that they can kind of understand and depend. So if you could just tell me, what is the current status, and do you see any hope for any independence?
I'm afraid I don't know much about the Cuban judiciary.
Better that you save my question to the end then. Don't want to bore everybody here.
Right, but they have had problems with some of the foreign businesses that have invested in Cuba, and they have been engaged in corrupt practices, and some of the businesses have been thrown out of the country, and some people have been jailed as a result, and some Cuban officials have also been jailed because of corrupt practices. The dual currency system sort of opens the door for all kinds of shenanigans like that, and hopefully that possibility will be reduced once they're able to merge the currencies. Over here, and then Ernie.
One is,
You gotta really speak up.
you were talking about agriculture, and there was a wonderful documentary that was made about the transition that happened after the Soviet Union collapsed. I don't remember the name of it, but if you know that and can share that, I think your audience would
Yeah.
really like that, because
Yeah,
it's
actually,
very informative.
there are two excellent documentaries. One is titled The Greening of Cuba, and the other is titled The Power of Community, How Cuba Survived Peak Oil. That's, yeah.
Okay, but my other question is.
By the way, we have information about both of those films on our website. If you go to globaljusticecenter.org, we have a video catalog there that lists information about a whole lot of videos on a variety of topics. And let me mention, I have a brief bibliography here. You're free to pick up, not enough copies for everyone, but a bibliography of mainly articles on our website about Cuba. Yeah,
Okay,
continue.
so how easy or difficult is it for foreign nationals to live in Cuba, or even possibly buy property?
Foreign nationals can buy property there now. How easy is it to live? Well, if you're a U.S. citizen and say are living on income from the U.S., it's very difficult. Although maybe if you can get your money out with an ATM, it'll become easier, but it has been difficult. But there are a number of U.S. citizens who have been living in Cuba for some time. How easy is it? Well, Cuba is a country where there are a lot of shortages. And if you're used to being able to go into the supermarket and load up on whatever it is you want, then you're going to have a problem in Cuba. But you can live well in Cuba if you wish. Oh, it's allowed, yeah. I know a number of USians who do live there. Yes.
What's the situation regarding the police, the citizens of Cuba, tourists, safety, and, it's not a police state, right?
Right, it's not a police state, right? Crime is very low, street crime, very, very low. Purse snatchings, that kind of thing happen in tourist areas. But violent crime is very rare. Havana is among one of the safest cities in the world, even safer than San Miguel. There was a problem in the 90s during the special period when there were lots of people, particularly from the eastern end of the country, rural areas, who came to Havana figuring that, well, it'll be easier living in Havana. And so there were areas of the city, particularly central Havana, became very congested. And so, the police had to, police presence had to be stepped up and so on. So there were some problems there in that regard. But that's not a serious problem now. Actually, a lot of those who came to Havana from Oriente stayed with relatives, overcrowding, already crowded housing. And so the government tried to move a lot of them back to the towns they had come from. And another Cuban joke was that Fidel had authorized a fleet of buses to take all of these people back to their hometowns. And when the transportation agency came with all of the buses, there was one limo. And And he asked, what's that for? He said, oh, well, that's for you. You're from the Oriente. Okay, who hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet? I've been delighted with all of these good questions. Yes, in the back. Jackie?
Mine is just a fun kind of question. The co-op idea to me is fascinating. But let me ask you, if you're in a co-op, like a restaurant co-op, and you don't want to be in the restaurant anymore, you want to be in the retail co-op, is there flexibility to change once you're in a co-op?
Yeah, you can change your employment to a different co-op. That's not a problem. Yeah, and Ernie?
Cliff, if they're evolving from a classless egalitarian society to a co-op where some are more successful than others and reap more rewards because of their ability and work, are we going to end up with classes of people? Some are fat cats and some aren't.
Well, first of all, Cuba was not a classless society. I mean, they abolished the capitalist class, but you know, everyone was not equal. I mean, there were bellhops who made more than neurosurgeons, right? These reforms are likely to increase those inequalities, and that's one of the areas of concern. Now, they don't want that inequality to get too wide, but they recognize that if you're going to provide material incentives for people to do better, produce more, or be more efficient, then you're going to have to accept that some are going to end up with more money than others. Okay. And last question.
What percentage of the population is under 50 approximately and over 50?
Well, I don't have statistics on that particular age break, but the majority of the Cuban population was born since the revolution. That's the important thing. That's the important statistic. That is, they have no memory of what it was like before when the mafia ran the country. And so, you know, like the older generation does. The other age-related statistic that's important is the growing aging of the population. You know, like the U.S., many other countries, you know, the demographics are changing, and you're getting larger and larger percentage of the population that are retired, and that means a smaller percentage of the population is of working age supporting those retirees. That's a problem that Cuba is going to be having to face in coming years.
What were the years of the mafia?
Well, 1959 was when it ended.
Prohibition.
The revolution, they were kicked out. And it wasn't just the revolutionary guerrillas that kicked them out. The people flooded into the casinos and overthrew the gaming tables and said, we don't want you anymore, because with the mafia came corruption, came prostitution, all kinds of social ills. It used to be said that the three most important people in Havana, this was before the revolution, were number one, the U.S. ambassador, number two, the head of the mafia, and number three, the Cuban president. He ranked after them. Well, thank you very much for a stimulating discussion.